Welcome, Dr. Green. So pleased you can join us today.
Thank you to Space & Co for hosting me as well. It's always a joy to talk to new audiences. I've been researching for over 20 years now, and I've worked individually with clients early on in my career as a clinical psychologist, helping people, address challenges after the curveballs have come. And in the last 10, 15 years, I've also been involved in executive coaching, and I launched the business, and we have a team of people now across Australia helping organisations and schools become the best that they can be. As I mentioned, we do work in schools. We also do, the majority of our work is in workplaces, but I always mention the work in schools because many people that we talk to in the workplace have children at school. So it'd be great to hear, through the chat box as well, whether you have kids at school. Perhaps they're not actually at school at the moment. Perhaps they're at home right now. It could be grandchildren, or it could be nieces and nephews. And what we found in the work that we do, particularly in the workplace, is that people are actually learning some of the skills that we're going to talk about today from their children. Because what's starting to happen is there's a field called positive education, which I'm very fortunate to have been involved with since it launched here in Australia. It actually launched down in Victoria at Geelong Grammar School, and I have an association with Geelong, but I wasn't involved in the initial launch. And then it's actually spread over the last 10 years across Australia, and it's going global right now, which is wonderful. And in a nutshell, it's taking out these skills of wellbeing, resilience and performance, which have been shown to affect overall mental health and wellbeing, but also academic achievement as well. So it's still relatively early days. It's not in all schools yet, but for me, it's just so inspiring to know and to hear that schools are adopting this approach, because our hope is into the future that by doing that perhaps we can reduce the levels of mental illness that are in our community right now, and also help people lead their best lives. So that's a little bit about us. The work that we do is all based on science. So it's not just, great ideas or self-help, if you like, although some of the ideas that are contained in self-help, you will find that there is some science underpinning them. It's not always clearly noted in those self-help books, but I've dedicated the last 20 years of my life to really exploring what it takes to be our best selves. And also at an organisational level as well. So we combine a number of the sciences that include positive psychology, which Mark and Shay have already mentioned, but also include fields like coaching psychology, which many of you may not have heard of, which actually launched here in Sydney at the University of Sydney. And we've just celebrated our 20-year celebration of teaching at Sydney University, the coaching psychology unit. So we've brought the science of coaching psychology to a field known as coaching, which has been around for a long time. Of course, sports coaching's been around for a long time, but executive and workplace coaching, which many of you will be familiar with, we've actually brought the science. And I've personally conducted, 4 randomised controlled trials on coaching now. So as well as working with people individually, I've done the research, so we know it works. It has a big impact not just on goal attainment, but on wellbeing. And we also draw on some complementary fields called appreciative inquiry. Again, some of you may have heard of that. If you haven't, I'd really encourage you to go away and do a bit more research on these fields. And the other field is positive organisational scholarship, which is sort of the complementary field of positive psychology, but most of their research has been done in organisations, and they study what they call the positive deviance. The positive deviant, so the organisations that are positively deviant from the mean, they're actually excelling. So rather than spending time on trying to understand why organisations don't flourish, if you like, they look at the ones that do and they try to understand what is it that they do that allow them to flourish. I'm assuming there are many people on the call today that may not have heard of the field of positive psychology. It's been around for about 20 years now, and we've got lots of research in the last 20 years. It is the science of optimal human functioning. So again, the study of us at our best. And as a clinical psychologist, in my training and in my practice, it was really all about helping people when they were really struggling and not at their best. So I'm really grateful that I did that study and that I spent time working with people in the early part of my career. But the last 10 or 15 years, I've really been working with people more from, I guess, a performance perspective and helping them to live their best lives. And as I said, most of that work is done in organisations. So the next slide will give a brief snapshot, again, of positive organisational scholarship. And you can see the T-shirt there, I am positively deviant. And it is the study of that which is positive, flourishing and life-giving in organisations. And so I spend a lot of my time talking about the F word. It's not rude. And if you haven't guessed already, it's actually flourishing. Now, some people love the term, other people don't like it. And I'm at a point in my career where I really don't care anymore. I guess I would just encourage you to look to the science. So whether you use the term flourishing or well-being or optimal functioning, it doesn't really matter, but there is a strong research base underneath that. But what we do know that there's been some epidemiological research that's shown that for any disorder, so this slide is specifically looking at mental illness and mental health, but for any disorder, that if you just treat that disorder, it's not a shift, it's not powerful enough to get a shift in population health and well-being. So what we really need is to shift our community mental health and well-being, proactive, preventative programs. And we would argue that the best place to run these programs are in schools, obviously, but also in workplaces. So there's a natural fit. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I want you to bear in mind that there are three primary, I guess, objectives or outcomes by taking this sort of approach. Right now, these approaches tend to sit in three separate buckets. So the first one is mental health and mental illness. So we are often called into an organisation when they want to be introduced, I guess, to the concepts of mental health first aid, trying to understand some of the mental disorders. And I guess we have been slowly starting to increase our knowledge in the community, you know, with organisations like Beyond Blue and Black Dog, who are doing a great job, Are You OK Day. The other area that we're called in for is wellbeing enhancement. And right now, a lot of organisations, and I'm going to ask you shortly, are doing things like, we call them the 3 Fs, which is fitness, fruit boxes and flu shots. And that's not bad, but we would argue that's not sufficient to really boost people's levels of psychological wellbeing. And we know that from the research that less than 20% of the population are flourishing. Most people are moderately mentally healthy, which is not bad, and other people are either what we call, moderately, I mentioned moderately mentally healthy or languishing. So languishing is not sufficient to receive a diagnosis of clinical depression, but certainly not feeling good and not feeling good, not functioning that well. So our aim is through these types of programs to really help more people flourish. So what is flourishing? To be honest, there's still quite a bit of debate in the scientific circles right now. There are different definitions and different ways to measure whether somebody is flourishing. But these are some of the concepts that are being studied right now. Today, we're going to focus in primarily on positive emotions because there's quite a lot of research to show the impact. And when I mention the word positivity, which I'll be talking more about today, we are generally speaking about experiencing a high level of positive emotionality and thinking more hopefully and more optimistically. So actually, it's an opportunity now for the audience. Are you flourishing? Now, just based on statistics and with the additional stressors that we're experiencing being at home, often with, everybody home at once, not much opportunity to get outside or go to the office, for example, we've got additional stressors. So chances are that perhaps even less than 20% of people are flourishing right now. And in the last couple of days, there have been a couple of blogs that have gone up on social media by mental health specialists suggesting that we need to be preparing for the long term. We're moving on to what is positivity. And I think first up, I want to say there are so many misconceptions about what it is. And I've even seen it on Instagram myself in the last few weeks by fairly learned people, I would say, people, influences that are sort of suggesting that we don't need positivity right now. And I think for me, that's because they don't fully understand the science underneath the word. Now, and of course, it depends on your definition of the word. So when we're talking about positivity, as I mentioned before, we're talking primarily about experiencing positive emotions like joy and gratitude and love and awe, which is when you observe something that's, awesome, if you like. And in fact, the research has found that there are 10 different positive emotions, not just happiness. And most of us have restricted emotional vocabularies because we have never really been educated around emotional literacy, if you like. So generally, we just tend to use the word happy when in fact the research has found there are quite a lot of different emotions. I also want to reiterate that this is not about being happy all of the time. And I usually say, as a clinical psychologist, they will lock you up if you are. So it's not normal to be walking around with a yellow, happy, smiley face all day, every day. It is absolutely normal to experience appropriate fear. Like when this first happened, the most, common emotion was fear of, oh my goodness, what does this mean? Am I going to get sick? Am my family going to get sick? Will I lose my job? So those emotions are absolutely normal and absolutely appropriate, and we don't want to get rid of them. And in fact, some of the research in psychology shows that the more you try to get rid of an emotion, the stronger it becomes. So some of the newer approaches in psychology are actually about inviting in the uninvited guests, as the poet Rumi suggested. It's actually saying you can sit with me and I can sit with this. It might not be comfortable. It might actually be very uncomfortable, these emotions. But if I'm curious about them, they're information and they might actually be telling me something that could be useful. So fear can move us into action sometimes, as the fight or flight mechanism that we're all aware of. I know for me, when fear hit, I just moved straight into hypermanic mode, if you like, becoming really solution focused, trying to come up with as many ideas and plans as I could to move forward with my business. So it is very important to recognise that when we're talking about positivity, we're not saying get rid of negativity completely. It will never get rid of it. What we're really talking about with positive emotions, and some of you may have seen that wonderful movie, Inside Out, with your children, perhaps without your children. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it because it was one of the first films that introduced the concept of the full range of human emotions. But of course, joy was my favourite character, at least, and who doesn't want to be joy? But we know from the research that joy and positivity is not just about feeling good. Of course, all those positive emotions, they feel good, but they actually affect how we function. We also know that they help us to do good in the world, because when we're feeling good, we're more likely to want to help others. And they've actually done experiments where they've induced people into positive mood states, and they've found that they are more likely to help a stranger or do a kind deed. Moving on now, in terms of the why of positivity, there's actually some theory that underpins it, and it's called broaden and build theory. And this theory has been around for quite a while now, created by Professor Barbara Fredrickson. And she suggested and hypothesised, and the theory has been tested, that much like our negative emotions, if you like, and we often think about them as being fear and anger and sadness, that they're there for a reason. So fear and anger protects us. If we're in a dangerous situation, that fight or flight mechanism will kick in. So what Barbara Fredrickson has suggested is that positive emotions are also there for our survival. But what they do is they help us create social bonds, which are absolutely essential. We're social animals. They help us develop resilience. There's a whole range of outcomes that arise when we're in these positive emotional states. Over the last 20 years, you can see the research has shown that when you induce people into positive mood states, and I've actually highlighted some of the specific research that I think is really relevant for right now, they widen our scope of attention. So when you put people into a positive mood state, they're more likely to be looking up. They see, their visual perception broadens, they see more in the environment. They're more creative. When you put them into a problem-solving exercise, you induce one group into a positive mood state, another into a negative. The positive will come up with a significantly longer list of ideas and solutions, which we really need right now. Increases creativity, improves our immune function. So on the flip side, we have about decades and decades of research to show that when you're feeling stressed, that it has a very negative effect on our immune functioning. So if you go into the fear state, which a lot of people have been with what's happening with COVID, you can actually affect your immune system, which is, not what we want right now in terms of maintaining our health and well-being. So many reasons as to why you would want to proactively invest in positivity. And this is really important because we do have, as humans, something known as the negativity bias. Some of you may be familiar with this. And that means that we are primed, or our whole organism is primed to look for things that can go wrong or that could kill us. That is never going to go away. And in fact, we don't want it to go away. But I want to say here now that some people have stronger negativity biases than others. I'm actually doing a webinar series at the moment with some lawyers. And there's been a lot of research that's been done to show that lawyers, I don't know if we have any on the call today, have very high rates of pessimism, which is, I guess, in a sense, this negativity bias to look for things that can go wrong, which is essential in their job. But if you take that lens from the workplace to home and start seeing all the things that are wrong with your family, it's going to have a very negative impact on your family. So just something to bear in mind there. So moving on, I haven't got too much longer to go, but there has been quite a lot of research in the last 20 years to show that happy or psychologically well individuals do well in every aspect of life: marriage, income, work performance and health. There's been lots of research in organisational settings to show that these type of, what they call them, positive workplace practices actually. So activities like gratitude being one of the big ones, compassion for people, which I'll talk about towards the end of today, forgiveness, because right now there's a good chance people are going to make mistakes just because we are in that fight or flight situation. And I think as leaders and as peers, we need to be a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more forgiving, that people generally are trying to do the best they can right now. And if you are a leader, I don't want to scare anybody, but some wonderful research out of the Ross School of Business at University of Michigan showing, you can see from the slide, they call it the positive energy of the leader and the impact it has on, this is the impact on the team members in terms of their job satisfaction, their well-being, their engagement, their performance, also back to their family. So it's actually called the social and emotional contagion effect. So most of us know that emotions are contagious and have heard of that term, the energy vampires, the people that you come into contact in the workplace that you walk away feeling drained. But on the positive side, there's great research to show that there are people that you'll have an interaction with and you'll walk away feeling, energized and motivated. And what they found from this research is that these positive energizers, they're not extroverted. In fact, because when you talk about positive energy, often a lot of people think it's about bubbliness or extroversion. So the researchers factored out extroversion, and it had nothing to do with extroversion at all. It had to do with how you made people feel. So when, as a leader, you came into contact with someone, were you completely 100% present with them, not on your phone or, noticing, doing something else, multitasking? Were you completely present? Were you validating? Were you reflecting back what you'd heard and validating the other person's perspective? And were you supportive of your people as well? So they are things that a lot of us, you'd hope, are naturally doing that, but it's certainly something that you can be more mindful of, particularly if you're a leader. So why now? The next slide is just reminding us that we are smack bang in the middle, I guess, of the VUCA world that we mentioned before. I mean, these are circumstances. They're the volatility, how quickly things can change rapidly. The uncertainty, which is possibly the biggest issue right now, and not knowing what's going to happen. When are we going back to, and it's not even going to be normal, the new normal, everyone's calling it. The complexity of how things are connected and the ripple effect and the ambiguity. So we are smack bang in the middle of that, but that is our new normal. That is the world that we're living in, and that's the world that we need to prepare our children to live in. So what we need to be able to thrive, which I know is important at Space & Co as well, is we need these psychological skills. We need key psychological skills that historically you wouldn't have learnt until you'd come crashing down and seen the psychologist, or you might have been fortunate enough to learn them with a great sports coach or perhaps with an executive coach. But right now, the majority of people in our community do not have these skills, and we need to get them out there as quickly as we can, I would argue. One thing that I haven't included today, but would be a fantastic activity to do, would be around introducing the concept of strengths. And there are three that I'd recommend. The first one is a character strengths, which is you can actually take a free assessment. If you go to the VIAinstitute.com, you can take a free assessment. We've used that in government organisations. It's being used extensively in schools. It helps people develop, I guess, some awareness about their character and the positive aspects of their character. So things like kindness and leadership, forgiveness, teamwork is in there. And then the other two strengths assessments, which some of your people may have used before, are the Gallup, it's called the Clifton Strengths Finder, and there's another one called Strengths Profile. And they are much more what we call performance strengths. They're very work focused, and running strong team sessions, introducing everyone does the assessment. Then you can do strength spotting, where you can anonymously, secretly admire or stalk, if you like, somebody in your team, and look for those strengths. And then over a period of time, you can give them feedback about what strengths you've seen them use with examples. So there's lots of things you can do, but you've got to keep it fresh. We use a very simple model for implementation, and it's a model that was created by Professor Aaron Jardine, who works down at the Positive Psychology Centre at the University of Melbourne, where I have an honorary position as well. And he calls it the me, we and us model. So when you are starting to look at implementation in your team, but probably more so across your organisation or department, if you like, you want to look at what can we do at the individual level. So what might be some activities that people could be encouraged to do. A really wonderful one is just reviewing their goals. So most people set performance goals or development goals, and then introducing one of those strengths assessment tools and looking at how you can explicitly link your strengths to your goals. Lots of research to show leads to increased goal attainment and well-being as well. So ideally, you would want to introduce some of these concepts to your team, and then everybody at an individual level would choose which intervention or which type of practice that they want to try. And because there are differences, what works for me may not work for you. Then at the we level is where we're looking at the leader and the team. And we often run additional training on positive leadership. So looking at concepts like strengths or mindfulness and how do they play out for you in your role as a leader? And then how do you introduce these concepts, and what are these concepts going to look like in our team compared to your team, for example? And then the us is what can we do across the organisation or the department? And that might be posters that remind people that act as what we call positive primes of the things that you want them to remember. It could be aspects of mindset. So we introduce the concept of ants, which are automatic negative thoughts. Everybody loves the concept of ants. We all have them. And then we very simply, it's not always simple, I have to add, but we'll often turn them into our pets, which are performance enhancing thoughts. So, having some signs reminding people about ants and pets or strengths or whatever it is can be really helpful. And also looking at policies and procedures, because as an organisation, if you are really serious about your people's well-being, you have to take a good hard look at those policies and procedures and structures, because some of them actively undermine well-being. So there's no point rolling this out to your staff who can become very cynical if your structures don't support or your policies don't support wellbeing or resilience. So our approach, we use a model called RAW, which I co-created with a colleague of mine. So we look at resilience, and with resilience, we look specifically at mental toughness, which I'll show you a model of in a moment. We look at wellbeing, and we introduce the science of positive psych. I do want to let you know that you can do a 2 years master's in positive psychology. So we're just scratching the surface today, really. And then the achievement piece, we use coaching and coaching psychology because, as many of you will know, the research suggests that people retain less than 10% from training days. So there's really no point spending money on training unless you use some sort of methodology to transfer training. And we would argue that coaching is one of the best levers to do that. It doesn't have to be an expensive professional coach. It could just be setting up some co-coaching situations with team members as well, but some way to follow on and ensure that what you've learned is actually being put into practice. The next slide actually does outline the mental toughness model. I won't have time to go into detail, but right now we are doing a number of programs based on mental toughness. It's a really user-friendly way to unpack resilience, which is known as a multi-dimensional construct in the science. So it's a very simple model made up of the 4 C's of challenge, control, confidence and commitment. You can take an assessment if you'd like, but you can also just self-assess around these 4 components, which also have some subscales. And then if I move to the next slide, another model we use is one that I've recently just published a book on called The Positivity Prescription. And there are 6 M's, and conveniently they all start with M. But this came about when I had a school principal ask me, Suzy, if you had a wish for a year 12 student walking out our gates for the very last time in terms of the key psychological skills that you wish they were equipped for going out into the world, what would they be? And so I went away, I reflected on the science, but mostly I reflected on my years of practice with individuals, and I came up with these 6 key psychological skills, which include a lot of the things we've spoken about already. Mindset techniques, which has been the bread and butter of psychologists. Motivation, we've got 40 years of research on the types of goals that support well-being and attainment. Mindfulness, might is strength, mood, so all these activities that can boost your positive emotional state, and meaning. And that's a very big topic in the workplace right now. So how do we help people tap in to a sense of meaning that also affects productivity? But if you want any more information, do not hesitate to reach out.